I still remember the exact words my sister said to me the morning after my husband's funeral. "Now that Daniel is gone," Linda said as she stood in my kitchen, looking around the room like she was inspecting a house for sale, "we should probably talk about what happens to the house." She didn't whisper it. She didn't soften it. She said it like it was the most practical thing in the world. The sunlight was just beginning to come through the kitchen window, the same window Daniel and I had installed ourselves nearly 30 years earlier, and for a moment I thought I must have misunderstood her. I had buried my husband less than 24 hours earlier. 42 years of marriage had ended with a quiet service at the small church 2 miles down the road, the same church where Daniel and I had been married when I was 26. I was still wearing the black sweater I had worn to the funeral, and the house still smelled faintly of the lilies people had sent. I stood at the kitchen counter holding a coffee mug that had long gone cold, trying to process what Linda had just said. "I'm Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and until that moment I believed I understood my family. But sometimes the truth about people shows itself at the exact moment you are least prepared to see it. If you're listening to my story, stay with me until the end, because what happened in that house over the next few days changed the way I see family forever." The kitchen felt too quiet without Daniel moving around behind me. For 42 years he had started every morning the same way, grinding coffee beans at exactly 6:30, humming old country songs while the kettle warmed on the stove. That morning the kettle never whistled. I hadn't even turned it on. Linda walked slowly across the room and rested her hand on the back of one of our dining chairs. It was the chair Daniel used to sit in every night during dinner, the one with the small scratch on the corner where he once dropped a screwdriver while fixing a loose leg. She ran her fingers over the wood like she was measuring something in her mind. "It's a big house for one person, Margaret," she continued. "Almost 3,000 square feet. Maintenance alone must be overwhelming." I stared at her, unsure how the conversation had moved from grief to square footage so quickly. This house wasn't just wood and walls. Daniel and I had bought the place when Ethan, our son, was only 5 years old. Back then the property needed everything. The roof leaked. The porch leaned slightly to the left. The yard looked more like a field than a lawn. But Daniel loved it the moment he saw it. I can still hear his voice from that afternoon when we first walked through the front door. "Give me a few years," he had told me with a smile, "and we'll turn this place into the kind of home people never want to leave." And he did. Every room carried his fingerprints in one way or another. The oak shelves in the living room. The wide deck behind the house where we used to watch summer thunderstorms roll across the valley. Even the kitchen window Linda was now standing beside had been his idea, installed one long Saturday afternoon while I held the ladder steady outside. Linda cleared her throat, pulling me back into the present. "Daniel was my brother," she said carefully. "And family property usually stays in the family." The words hung in the air between us like a question she had already answered for herself. I set my coffee mug down slowly on the counter. Something about the way she said it made the room feel colder. At first I told myself she didn't mean anything by it. People say strange things when emotions are high, especially after a funeral. But the look on Linda's face wasn't grief. It was calculation. And in that quiet kitchen, with Daniel gone and the house suddenly feeling far too large, I began to understand that the real story of what would happen to my home had only just begun. For the first few seconds after Linda said those words, I did not answer her. I simply looked around the kitchen as if the room itself might explain what was happening. The refrigerator hummed quietly. The clock above the stove ticked with slow, patient certainty. Everything in that house still moved at the rhythm Daniel and I had built over 4 decades, yet somehow the atmosphere had shifted overnight. Linda pulled out one of the dining chairs and sat down as if she had already decided the conversation would continue. She folded her hands on the table and looked at me with a polite expression that felt strangely rehearsed. I had seen that look before during family gatherings when she was about to introduce a subject nobody else wanted to discuss. "I am not saying anything needs to happen immediately," she said in a calm voice. "You have been through a lot. But at some point we need to think about what is fair. The word fair lingered in my mind. For 42 years Daniel and I had paid every mortgage payment, every property tax bill, every repair invoice that came with owning an older home. I remembered the winter 15 years earlier when a snowstorm damaged part of the roof. Daniel had spent an entire weekend up there in freezing wind replacing shingles because hiring a contractor would have cost more than we could comfortably spend at the time. Linda had not been there for that weekend. She had not been there for the dozens of smaller moments that slowly transform a house into a home. I leaned against the kitchen counter and crossed my arms, trying to keep my voice steady. Daniel and I built our life here, I said. This is where Ethan grew up. This house belongs to this family already. Linda gave a small nod as if she expected that answer. Then she said something that made the room feel even colder. Exactly. That is why it should stay in the family. At first the sentence sounded almost reasonable, but something about the way she said it made the meaning clear. In her mind I was no longer the center of that family story. I was simply the person currently living in the building. The idea settled heavily in my chest. I walked slowly to the sink and turned the faucet on for a moment, mostly so I could collect my thoughts. Outside the window the backyard looked exactly the same as it had the day before. The wooden fence Daniel installed still ran along the property line. The maple tree near the deck was beginning to turn the soft red color it always did in early fall. It was the same yard where Ethan learned to ride his first bicycle. The same yard where Daniel once spent 3 entire weekends building a small treehouse that lasted nearly 20 years. When I turned the water off and faced Linda again, she was studying the room carefully, her eyes moving from the cabinets to the hallway that led toward the living room. It was the way a real estate agent looks at a property. That realization sent a quiet ripple of unease through me. You know, she continued, a house this size must be worth a considerable amount now. The market around here has grown a lot in the last 10 years. She spoke about the value of the property the way someone might talk about a stock portfolio or a business investment. I realized then that this conversation was not about memories. It was about numbers. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slowly. My hands rested on the wooden table Daniel had refinished only a few years earlier. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence stretched across the room like a thin line that neither of us wanted to cross first. Finally Linda leaned forward slightly and said something that changed the entire tone of the morning. Daniel and I talked about the house once, she said quietly. He understood that family property sometimes needs to return to its original side. I stared at her. In 42 years of marriage Daniel had never once suggested that this home belonged to anyone except the two of us. The certainty in Linda's voice made my stomach tighten. Because if she truly believed what she was saying, then this conversation was only the beginning of something much bigger than a simple misunderstanding. I did not answer Linda right away. The words she had just spoken stayed in the air like a faint echo that refused to disappear. Daniel and I talked about the house once. The sentence did not fit with anything I knew about my husband. Daniel was not a man who made quiet promises behind closed doors. He believed in clarity. When he made decisions about our life he spoke about them directly, usually while standing right in this kitchen with a cup of coffee in his hand. I studied my sister carefully, trying to understand where this sudden certainty of hers was coming from. Linda had always been confident, sometimes too confident, but this felt different. There was something planned behind the calm tone of her voice. What exactly do you mean by that? I asked slowly. She leaned back in the chair as if she had expected that question all along. The morning sunlight had moved farther across the floor and now reached the legs of the dining table. I noticed the way Linda's fingers tapped lightly against the wood while she spoke, the same quiet rhythm people use when they believe time is on their side. Daniel understood that eventually things change, she said. When he and I spoke about the house a few years ago he admitted that it might make sense for the property to stay connected to his side of the family. For a moment I wondered if I had misheard her again. The idea sounded so far removed from the man I had shared my life with that it felt almost unreal. Daniel had been practical about many things in life, but when it came to our home he had always been deeply sentimental. I remembered a night about 10 years earlier when we sat together on the back deck during a summer storm. The rain had been falling steadily for hours and we watched the water run down the wooden steps he had built himself. Daniel had looked around the yard with a quiet smile and said something that had stayed with me ever since. He told me that houses come and go but the life you build inside them is what matters. That was the kind of man he was. He did not speak about family homes like they were investments to be returned to some invisible owner. Linda continued speaking while I sat there remembering that night. You have to think about the long term, she said gently. You are 68 now. Maintaining a house this size alone is not easy. Taxes, repairs, insurance, all of that adds up. The way she listed those things made it sound less like concern and more like preparation. As if she had already calculated the outcome she wanted. I folded my hands on the table and looked directly at her. Daniel never mentioned anything like that to me, I said. Not once in 42 years. Linda gave a soft sigh that sounded almost sympathetic. Sometimes people talk differently with siblings, she replied. There are conversations husbands and wives do not always share. That sentence settled heavily in my chest. 4. The first time that morning I felt something beyond confusion. I felt the quiet beginning of doubt. Not about Daniel, but about the situation unfolding in front of me. Because if Linda truly believed that story then she had built an entire expectation around it. The house suddenly felt larger than it had an hour earlier. Larger and strangely unfamiliar. The hallway leading to the living room looked darker than usual, and the silence inside the house seemed to stretch longer between each tick of the clock above the stove. I realized that the conversation had quietly crossed a line. This was no longer a casual remark made in grief. Linda believed she had a claim. And the calm way she spoke suggested that she was not planning to walk away from it easily. After Linda left that morning the house felt unusually quiet, the kind of silence that settles slowly and then refuses to move. I stood in the kitchen for several minutes without doing anything at all, simply looking around the room as if I were seeing it for the first time. The sunlight had shifted farther across the floor and now touched the cabinets Daniel had painted himself nearly 15 years earlier. I could still remember the afternoon he finished them. He had stepped back, wiped the paint from his hands, and asked me if the color looked warm enough. That was Daniel. He never made decisions about our home alone. Every choice we made about that house was shared. The memory of that moment made Linda's claim feel even stranger. According to her, Daniel had spoken about the house as if it belonged to some larger family history, something that needed to return to his side eventually. But the Daniel I knew did not talk about our life that way. For him the house was not a family asset. It was the place where our life happened day after day. I walked slowly into the living room and sat down in the chair Daniel used to occupy every evening while watching the news. From that chair you could see almost the entire front yard through the wide windows he had insisted on installing when we renovated the room 10 years earlier. The grass outside moved gently in the wind, exactly the same as it had the day before, yet the house no longer felt as steady as it once did. Linda's words had introduced a question into the space, and once a question enters a quiet home it has a way of echoing through every room. I tried to remember every conversation Daniel and I had ever had about the house. 42 years is a long time, but certain discussions remain clear. When Ethan left for college we had talked about whether we should downsize. Daniel had refused the idea almost immediately. He said the house held too many memories to walk away from. Another time a neighbor mentioned how much property values had increased in the area and suggested that selling the house could bring a significant profit. Daniel had simply laughed and said money was not the reason we built a home. Thinking back on those moments now, I realized something important. Daniel had always spoken about the house in terms of us. Not him alone. Not his side of the family. Always us. That certainty should have comforted me, yet Linda's confidence earlier that morning had been unsettling. People do not speak with that level of certainty unless they believe they have some kind of evidence behind them. The thought stayed with me while I walked down the hallway toward our bedroom. Daniel's jacket still hung on the hook behind the door where he left it the night before his heart gave out. I ran my hand across the fabric for a moment and felt the familiar weight of the cloth between my fingers. The room looked exactly the same as it had before the funeral, yet everything inside it carried a different meaning now. Losing Daniel had already changed the rhythm of my life. Now Linda had introduced another change, one I had not expected at all. The possibility that someone else believed they had a claim to the place Daniel and I had built together. I sat down on the edge of the bed and looked around the room slowly. The framed photographs on the dresser showed decades of ordinary moments. Ethan standing proudly beside his first car. Daniel holding a fishing rod at the lake where we spent several summers during retirement. Me and Daniel sitting on the back deck during a 4th of July barbecue with neighbors and friends. Those photographs told the real story of the house. A story built slowly across 42 years of shared life. And yet Linda had spoken as if none of that history mattered. As if the house itself belonged somewhere else entirely. The thought made me uneasy in a way I could not easily explain. Because if Linda truly believed what she said earlier that morning, then this conversation was not finished. It was only beginning. I did not sleep much that night. The house creaked the way older houses always do after midnight, small sounds that usually fade into the background when life feels stable. But that night every sound felt louder. The hallway floor shifted slightly with the cool air coming through the vents. The branches of the maple tree outside brushed softly against the siding. I lay awake listening to it all, thinking about the conversation with Linda and the strange certainty in her voice. Around 2 in the morning I finally got up and walked quietly into the kitchen. The digital clock on the microwave read 2:14. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window looking out at the backyard. Daniel and I had spent countless evenings in that yard, especially during the last years before he retired. He used to say the backyard felt like our own small world, a place where time moved slower. That memory brought a small wave of comfort, but the uneasiness from earlier that day had not disappeared. In fact, it had grown stronger. The next morning the house felt different again, not because anything had physically changed, but because the quiet question Linda had introduced was still there. I made coffee the way Daniel always did, measuring the beans carefully and letting the kettle warm slowly on the stove. The smell filled the kitchen and for a moment everything felt almost normal again. Then the phone rang. The sound startled me more than it should have. Hardly anyone calls early in the morning anymore, and for a second I expected to hear Ethan's voice on the other end. Instead, the voice that greeted me was calm, professional, and unfamiliar. The man introduced himself as Robert Carter. He explained that he had been Daniel's attorney for several years. The name sounded familiar. Daniel had mentioned a lawyer a few times during the past decade, mostly when he updated paperwork related to retirement accounts and insurance policies. I had never met the man myself. Mr. Carter spoke in the careful tone of someone used to dealing with sensitive situations. He said he had heard about Daniel's passing and offered his condolences first. Then he paused briefly before continuing. There was something in his voice that made me stand a little straighter beside the kitchen counter. He explained that Daniel had left several documents with his office that were meant to be reviewed after certain circumstances. According to him, Daniel had been very particular about the timing of those instructions. Hearing that made my stomach tighten slightly. Daniel had always been organized, but he was not the kind of man who enjoyed complicated legal planning. Your husband believed it was important that you have access to these papers personally, Mr. Carter said. He wanted to make sure you understood everything clearly. The kettle began to whistle softly behind me while he spoke, but I did not move to turn it off right away. My attention had shifted completely to the conversation. I asked him what kind of documents he was referring to. Mr. Carter did not answer immediately. Instead, he suggested that it would be better if we spoke in person. His office was located about 15 miles from my house in the small downtown district where Daniel and I used to run errands on Saturdays. The drive would take about 20 minutes. Normally I would have hesitated to leave the house so soon after the funeral, but something about the timing of the call felt important. I thanked him for reaching out and told him I would come by later that afternoon. After I hung up the phone, I stood in the kitchen for several seconds without moving. The kettle continued to whistle until I finally reached over and turned off the stove. Steam drifted slowly toward the ceiling. I poured the hot water over the coffee grounds and watched the dark liquid fill the glass pot. My mind kept returning to the words Mr. Carter had used. Daniel had been very particular about the timing. The phrase stayed with me while I sat at the kitchen table holding the warm mug between my hands. Outside, the morning sun had begun to light the backyard again. Everything looked calm and familiar, yet the quiet tension from the day before had shifted slightly. For the first time since Linda walked into my kitchen and questioned the future of my home, I had the distinct feeling that Daniel might have anticipated something like this long before it ever happened. I arrived at Robert Carter's office a little before 3 in the afternoon. The drive into town felt longer than usual, even though I had taken that same road hundreds of times over the years. The autumn air had turned cooler overnight and the trees along the highway were beginning to show the first deep shades of red and orange. Daniel always loved this time of year. He used to say the changing leaves made even familiar roads feel new again. That thought stayed with me as I parked the car across the street from the small brick building where Mr. Carter worked. His office sat on the second floor above a quiet insurance agency. The narrow staircase creaked softly as I walked up each step. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. A young receptionist greeted me politely and asked me to wait for a moment. I sat down in a chair beside a window that overlooked the town square. People moved calmly along the sidewalks below, going about their ordinary afternoon routines. Watching them felt strangely distant, as if the quiet tension that had settled into my life during the past 2 days existed in a separate world entirely. After a few minutes, the receptionist opened a door and invited me inside. Robert Carter stood up from behind a large wooden desk when I entered the room. He looked to be in his late 50s, with neatly combed gray hair and the steady expression of someone who had spent many years working with serious matters. He shook my hand gently and offered his condolences again. The kindness in his voice felt genuine. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he walked to a tall cabinet behind his desk and removed a thick folder. He placed it carefully on the table between us before sitting down again. The folder looked ordinary enough, the kind lawyers use for any number of documents, but the way Mr. Carter handled it made it clear that its contents mattered. He explained that Daniel had visited his office several times over the past decade to organize different aspects of his estate planning. Most of it involved retirement accounts, insurance policies, and other financial arrangements that couples often review as they grow older. I listened quietly while he spoke, my hands resting in my lap. Then he opened the folder and removed a set of papers clipped neatly together. The first page was a legal document printed on thick white paper. I recognized the format immediately, even though I had not seen one in many years. It was a property deed. Mr. Carter slid the document toward me so that I could read the top line clearly. My name appeared there in bold type. Margaret Collins. Beneath it was the full legal description of the property where Daniel and I had lived for so long. The address. The lot number. The county records. Everything about the house was written there with precise detail. I looked up at Mr. Carter, unsure what I was supposed to understand yet. He nodded slightly, as if he had expected that reaction. Then he explained something that made the entire room feel suddenly quieter. Nearly 12 years earlier, Daniel had transferred the legal ownership of the house entirely into my name. The change had been recorded with the county office and confirmed through the proper legal channels. According to the document in front of me, the house was not shared property anymore. It belonged solely to me. For a moment I simply stared at the paper. Daniel had never mentioned making that change. Mr. Carter seemed to understand my confusion. He explained that Daniel had insisted on keeping the arrangement simple and secure. His intention had been to remove any possibility of confusion or dispute in the future. As those words settled into my mind, I felt something shift quietly inside me. The uneasy uncertainty that had followed Linda's visit began to loosen its grip. Because suddenly I understood something very important. Long before anyone else began questioning the future of my home, Daniel had already taken steps to protect it. For several seconds I did not speak. I simply looked down at the document resting on the polished surface of Robert Carter's desk. The paper itself looked simple, almost ordinary, yet the words printed across it carried a weight I had not expected to feel that afternoon. My name appeared clearly as the sole legal owner of the property. Not shared ownership. Not partial rights. The house belonged entirely to me. I traced the line of text slowly with my eyes, reading it again just to make certain I had not misunderstood anything. 12 years earlier Daniel had signed the paperwork transferring the deed. 12 years. That meant he had made this decision long before the quiet tension that appeared in my kitchen 2 days ago. Long before Linda walked into my house and spoke as if the future of that home was already settled in her mind. Mr. Carter remained silent while I read, giving me the time to absorb what the document meant. Finally I looked up at him. "Daniel never told me about this," I said quietly. My voice sounded calmer than I expected. The lawyer nodded in a thoughtful way that suggested he had heard similar reactions before. He explained that Daniel had been very clear about one thing when he completed the transfer. He wanted the arrangement to be simple and secure, without unnecessary attention drawn to it while he was still alive. According to Mr. Carter, Daniel believed that certain decisions only create complications when discussed too early. Instead, he preferred to make sure the proper protections were already in place. Hearing that explanation made something inside me settle into place. The more I thought about it, the more it sounded exactly like the man I had known for 42 years. Daniel had always been practical in quiet ways. He did not make dramatic announcements about responsible choices. He simply handled them and trusted that the right moment would come when they mattered. I looked down at the deed again and felt a wave of quiet gratitude move through me. Not the loud emotional kind that demands attention, but the steady recognition that someone you loved had been thinking about your future long before you realized it. Mr. Carter carefully returned the document to the folder but left it open on the desk. He explained that I was welcome to keep a certified copy for my records. The original remained safely stored with the county office, which meant the legal ownership was already established beyond question. The words "beyond question" stayed with me while I listened. Only 2 days earlier I had been sitting in my kitchen wondering whether Linda believed she had some claim to the home Daniel and I built together. Now the situation looked very different. Not because of anger or confrontation, but because of a single piece of paper that quietly told the truth. After a few more minutes I thanked Mr. Carter for explaining everything so clearly. He walked me to the office door and wished me well before I left. When I stepped back onto the sidewalk, the afternoon sun felt warmer than it had earlier in the day. The town square looked exactly the same as when I arrived, people moving between shops and parked cars in the calm rhythm of everyday life. Yet something inside me had changed during that meeting. The uneasy question that had followed me since Linda's visit was gone. In its place was a quiet certainty that Daniel had already answered the problem long before it appeared. I drove home slowly that afternoon, the folded copy of the deed resting on the passenger seat beside me. By the time I reached the long gravel driveway leading up to the house, I understood something very clearly. Whatever conversation waited ahead with my sister, it would not unfold the way she expected. I pulled into the driveway just as the late afternoon sun began to settle behind the trees at the edge of the property. The gravel shifted softly beneath the tires, the familiar sound echoing across the quiet yard. For a moment I sat in the car without turning off the engine, looking at the house the same way Daniel and I had done so many evenings after returning home from town. The place looked exactly the same as it always had. The wide porch stretched across the front. The white railing Daniel painted every other summer caught the light in thin golden lines. Nothing about the house suggested that anything had changed, yet I knew something important had shifted during the past 24 hours. The folded copy of the deed rested beside me on the passenger seat. I placed my hand on it for a moment before picking it up and slipping it carefully into my purse. The paper itself was simple, but the meaning behind it carried a quiet strength. Daniel had seen something coming long before I did. That thought stayed with me as I stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the front door. The evening air smelled faintly of dry leaves and distant wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace. Autumn had fully settled into the valley. When I stepped inside the house, the familiar calm of the living room greeted me again. The furniture sat exactly where it always had. The photographs on the shelves reflected the same years of ordinary family life that had filled the rooms for decades. I placed my purse on the kitchen table and stood there for a moment listening to the quiet of the house. Earlier that week the silence had felt heavy. Now it felt steady again. I had just begun to pour myself a glass of water when I heard a car pulling into the driveway outside. The sound was unmistakable. Tires on gravel, slow and deliberate. I did not need to look through the window to know who it was. Linda stepped onto the porch a moment later and knocked once before opening the door. She had always been comfortable entering without waiting long for an invitation. Her expression carried the same calm confidence she had shown the previous morning. "I thought I would stop by again," she said as she walked into the kitchen. "We still need to talk about the house." The sentence sounded almost identical to the one she used before, as if she had spent the entire day rehearsing it. I leaned lightly against the counter and studied her face for a moment. It was strange how different the conversation felt now compared to yesterday. The uncertainty that had followed her first visit was gone. In its place was a quiet patience. Linda sat down at the dining table again, the same chair she had used before. She placed her purse beside her and folded her hands neatly on the wood surface. "I have been thinking about what we discussed," she continued. "It really would make sense to sell the property and divide things fairly. That would be the most practical solution for everyone." The word practical again. She spoke it as if the decision had already been agreed upon. I walked slowly to the table and pulled out the chair across from her. The evening light had begun to drift through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the floor. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I opened my purse and removed the folded paper Robert Carter had given me earlier that afternoon. I placed it gently on the table between us but did not unfold it yet. Linda's eyes moved immediately to the paper. Curiosity flickered across her expression. "What is that?" she asked. I looked at her calmly and rested my hands on the table beside the document. The quiet strength I felt in that moment came not from anger or confrontation but from the simple certainty Daniel had left behind. The answer to the question she had been asking since yesterday was already written on that page. All that remained now was for her to read it. For a few seconds Linda did not touch the paper. She simply stared at it as if she expected it to explain itself before she even unfolded it. The kitchen had grown quieter as the sun moved lower outside, and the long shadows across the floor made the room feel calmer than it had earlier in the day. I watched her expression carefully, not with anger, but with the kind of quiet attention that comes when you already know how a conversation will end. Finally she reached forward and picked up the folded document. The paper made a soft sound as she opened it slowly. Her eyes moved across the page line by line. At first her face showed nothing more than curiosity. Then the calm certainty she carried into the house began to shift. The confidence in her posture softened slightly as she read the bold heading near the top of the page. I could almost see the moment the meaning became clear to her. Her eyes paused on my name printed across the document. Margaret Collins. Beneath it was the full legal description of the property. The house. The land. The entire place Daniel and I had built together across more than 4 decades. Linda continued reading quietly for another moment before lowering the paper just enough to look at me. The room remained silent except for the steady ticking of the clock above the stove. "What is this?" she asked carefully, though the question sounded more like hesitation than confusion. I folded my hands on the table and answered in the same calm tone I had used all afternoon. It is the deed to the house. Linda looked back down at the document again as if hoping she had misunderstood something in the wording. The legal language was clear and precise, the kind of language that does not leave room for interpretation. 12 years earlier Daniel had transferred the ownership of the property entirely into my name. The county records had confirmed it. The document in her hands was simply a certified copy. For a long moment she said nothing. The confidence that filled her voice during our first conversation had quietly disappeared. Instead there was a thoughtful silence that settled between us like dust slowly drifting onto a still surface. She placed the paper back onto the table with more care than before. "He never told me about this," she said. I nodded slightly. "He never told me either." That seemed to surprise her more than anything else. Linda leaned back in the chair and looked around the kitchen again, but this time her eyes moved across the room differently. The cabinets Daniel painted. The table he refinished. The window that looked out over the backyard. All the small pieces of our life together were still there, exactly where they had always been. The difference now was that the future of the house no longer existed as a question. Daniel had answered it long ago in the quiet way he handled most important decisions. After a few minutes Linda stood up from the table and picked up her purse. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at the document once more before folding it carefully and sliding it back toward me. "I suppose that settles things," she said. The words carried a tone of acceptance that had not existed when she first walked into the house. I nodded once more and placed the paper back inside my purse. Linda walked toward the front door slowly, pausing for a moment on the porch before stepping down onto the gravel driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as she got into her car and drove away. The sound of the tires faded gradually down the road until the evening quiet returned to the property again. I stood there for a while looking out across the backyard where Daniel and I had spent so many ordinary days together. The maple tree moved gently in the breeze, the same way it had moved the morning before the funeral and the day before that and countless days before that. The house had not changed. The walls still held the same memories. The room still carried the same quiet warmth of the life we built together. The only difference now was the understanding Daniel had left behind. Long before anyone questioned where the house belonged, he had already made sure the truth would speak for itself.